When you think about Nazi-occupied Europe, resistance might conjure up specific, maybe even heroic images. But the truth, it was far more widespread, varied, and complex than we often imagine.
Absolutely. It wasn't a single movement, more like countless fires catching across the continent, each burning differently.
And that's exactly what we're exploring today, drawing heavily on Halik Kochanski's amazing work, Resistance, the Underground War in Europe, 1939-1945. It's really the first time someone's pulled together all these, well, separate national stories into one big picture.
It's a monumental piece of research. She really synthesizes so much.
We'll also be weaving in some perspectives inspired by mindful moments. That YouTube channel, using AI for book analysis, it really sparks some interesting ways to think about this kind of history.
Good idea. It helps frame things.
So our aim is to get beyond those perhaps simpler narratives and really understand the motivations, the actions, the sheer variety of resistance, and ultimately, its significance.
And one of the first things Kochanski makes really clear is how the type of Nazi occupation shaped the resistance that emerged. It wasn't uniform at all.
How so?
Well, take countries the Nazis initially saw as Aryan, like, say, Denmark or Norway. The occupation started, relatively speaking, less brutally.
Right.
So organized, large-scale resistance took a bit longer to really get going there compared to other places.
Right, which contrasts sharply with somewhere like Poland, doesn't it?
Exactly. Kochanski details how the immediate, absolutely savage brutality of the occupation in Poland meant resistance sparked almost instantly. It was a direct response to existential threat.
So the occupiers' own actions were, in a way, catalysts.
Precisely. And it's also key to understand the timeline Kochanski lays out. We often think of armed partisans, right?
The fighters in the hills, that kind of image.
But large-scale armed resistance, while important, really became a major factor later in the war, I think 1943 onwards.
So what was happening before then?
A lot, actually. Early on, resistance often involved smaller acts. Defiance, gathering intelligence, maybe sheltering people, printing leaflets, all incredibly risky, but perhaps less overtly military.
And this is where Kochanski really broadens the map for us, isn't it? Moving beyond the perhaps more famous French resistance.
Oh, definitely. She gives equal weight to what was happening in the Nordic countries, the Baltic states, Czechoslovakia, across the Balkans, Greece, areas often pushed to the margins in popular history.
Can you give an example, something that highlights that wider scope?
Well, she talks about intelligence networks in Greek cities. I mean, think about the risks. People using incredibly clever methods to hide what they were doing, feeding information to the Allies.
And did it have an impact?
A huge impact. Kochanski links this specific intelligence directly to the sinking of numerous Axis supply ships in the Mediterranean. That's tangible. Local people, immense bravery, directly affecting the war effort.
It makes you wonder, what drove people to take such, well, unbelievable risks? What were the motivations?
Kochanski explores this deeply. It wasn't just one thing, you know? For many, it was profound patriotism. They just couldn't stand by and watch their country be destroyed.
That makes sense. National pride, identity.
Yes, but also political conviction, a fierce belief in democracy or socialism or communism, opposition to fascism on ideological grounds. And then there's sheer moral outrage.
Just seeing the brutality and saying, no, this is wrong.
Exactly. A fundamental human reaction to inhumanity. And we shouldn't forget religious faith for some, or simply the desperate need to protect family and community. Survival, in a way, became an act of resistance, too.
And Kochanski is very clear about the cost, right? The danger wasn't abstract.
Not at all. The Nazis routinely used collective punishment. Reprisals against entire villages or communities for the actions of a few resistors were horrifyingly common. Resisting meant potentially condemning your neighbors, your family.
That context. It just makes the courage of those who did resist even more extraordinary. And Kochanski points out they were a minority, yeah.
Yes, she's very clear on that. Most people were understandably focused on survival, navigating what she terms the gray area. Trying to get by, making compromises, perhaps.
Which doesn't diminish the actions of the resistors, but it grounds it in reality.
It highlights their bravery, I think. Making that conscious choice, knowing the stakes when most people felt they couldn't.
So let's talk about the forms resistance took. We mentioned armed struggle came later and intelligence gathering.
Escape lines were vital. Think of the Comet Line, helping Allied airmen evade capture. Incredibly complex, dangerous operations run by ordinary citizens.
Right, getting people out.
Then there was the underground press. Crucial for countering Nazi propaganda, maintaining morale, sharing information. Just printing or possessing a pamphlet could mean death.
And sabotage.
Hugely important. Disrupting railway lines, factories, communication networks, anything to hinder the German war machine. Kochanski also highlights cultural resistance.
What did that look like?
Singing forbidden songs, teaching banned history or language, maintaining cultural traditions in secret. Subtle, maybe, but powerful ways to preserve national identity against an occupier trying to erase it. Even basic civil disobedience counted.
And she gives specific attention to Jewish resistance, doesn't she? And Christian responses too.
Yes, very much so. She details the specific, horrific context of Jewish resistance, like the ghetto uprisings, but also other forms. And she examines the varied, sometimes difficult responses within Christian communities across Europe. It's complex.
It sounds like these often started as small separate actions, but then they grew,
Yeah,
became more organized.
that's generally the pattern. Kochanski tracks how movements develop structures, methods for recruitment, secret communication networks, all incredibly difficult under constant surveillance.
And what about the Allies? Like Britain's Special Operations Executive, the SOE, did they play a big role?
They played a role, certainly, providing supplies, training, communication links sometimes. Kochanski examines those relationships. But she emphasizes that the vast majority of resistance was homegrown. Locally initiated, locally driven. Allied support was often helpful, sometimes crucial, but it wasn't the primary engine. Ordinary people responding to their reality.
And that links back to themes often explored by channels like Mindful Moments and, well, in our own discussions here, the complexities of wartime alliances and motivations. These movements weren't monolithic, were they? Politically, I mean.
Not at all. Kochanski is clear about the political dimensions. Communist and various left-leaning groups were often at the forefront of organized resistance, especially later in the war. This sometimes led to friction, even conflict with other non-communist groups.
Setting the stage for post-war tensions, perhaps.
Definitely. You see that very clearly in places like Yugoslavia or Greece, where conflicts between different resistance factions were essentially early battles of the Cold War. Kochanski doesn't shy away from these darker aspects, the internal conflicts.
So when we look back, what was the actual impact of all this resistance? Did it change the military outcome?
Kochanski argues that, militarily, resistance alone was rarely decisive in winning battles or campaigns. That's important to state.
Okay. So what was its contribution?
It was significant, just in different ways. Intelligence provided was often invaluable to the Allies. Sabotage genuinely disrupted logistics and production. Resistance forces tied down huge numbers of German troops who could have been fighting elsewhere.
That's a major strategic contribution, even if indirect.
Absolutely. And perhaps just as importantly, it sustained civilian morale. It kept hope alive. It preserved a sense of national identity and dignity in the face of utter darkness.
That sense of refusing to be completely crushed.
Exactly. Which leads to Kochanski's ultimate conclusion about the significance of resistance.
Which is?
That its deepest importance lies in the moral dimension. It was a fundamental refusal to accept tyranny, an assertion of human values, of dignity against overwhelming brutality.
There's that quote she uses, isn't there? From a resistance fighter.
Yes, powerful words about wanting to be able to look the Allied soldiers in the eye without blushing. It captures that sense of moral self-respect, of having done something, however small, against the evil.
So, pulling it all together, the key takeaway is really the sheer breadth, the diversity, and the profound moral weight of this underground war across Europe.
I think so. Kochanski's work gives us such a vital, nuanced picture, far beyond the usual narratives. It honors the complexity and the courage involved.
And maybe it leaves us with something to think about today, doesn't it?
Definitely. How does this history resonate now? When we see different forms of oppression or challenges to basic values today, what lessons can we draw from the choices people made back then? The courage it took to say no.
That's a challenging thought to end on. If this discussion has sparked your interest, please subscribe to the show for more explorations like this one.
And share it with anyone you think might find it valuable.
We'll put a link to Halik Kochanski's Resistance in the show notes if you want to dive deeper yourself. Highly recommended.
And, as always, keep thinking critically about history, its complexities, and what it means for us now.